Welcome back to Ray's Talk Show, the podcast that shares the Latino perspective on politics and other hot issues of the day. This is your host, Ray Collazo. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy belated International Women's Day if you're catching this after Thursday. Catch Ray's Talk Show anywhere you can download a podcast: iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify. Anywhere you can download a podcast, and you can always check out our website, rayspodcast.com, at Ray's Podcast on Twitter, or at Ray's Latino Talk on Instagram. On this week's episode, we talked to political activists Cristina TzinTzun and Yvonne Gutierrez about this week's Texas primary elections and what they mean for Texas and Latinos around the country. And later in the show, I will share my thoughts on Attorney General Jeff Sessions' shameful stunt in California and the historic moment for Latin America and liberation theology that also took place this week. Let's hear now from Cristina TzinTzun of Jolt, Texas, and we will be back to discuss the other hot topics impacting our world on Ray's Talk Show. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Ray's Talk Show. I'm honored to welcome, for the first time on Ray's Talk Show, the Executive Director of Jolt, Texas, Cristina TzinTzun. Cristina, welcome finally to Ray's Talk Show.
Oh, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Cristina, again, the Executive Director of Jolt, Texas. Jolt, Texas builds the political power and influence of Latinos in our democracy through civic engagement and issue-based organizing, and a great IG follow, Jolt, Texas. They're doing some exciting things on social media, and we definitely want to promote the good work you're doing and how to follow what you're doing. Cristina, again, thank you so much for joining us on Ray's Talk Show today. Yesterday's primary elections were historic in Texas politics. And before we get into some of the specific races, Cristina, can you share with our listeners broadly why yesterday's elections were so important for Latinos in Texas and nationwide?
Well, I think that if you look at where our country is headed, Texas is really emblematic of the future of the country. So many people in power right now in the Republican Party are scared because the majority of our country will soon be people of color and the children of immigrants. In Texas, we already are, fueled in large part by the growth of the Latino population. So we already make up 40% of the population here in Texas. By 2030, we will be the majority. And even though we will soon be the majority and make up a significant portion of the population, our community is not treated with the respect or power we deserve, which is why we founded Jolt, to change that, to take the power of our numbers and turn that into real voting and organizing power, so that Latinos are treated with the respect that we deserve, and to be able to win on the issues that matter to our community. So yesterday was very historic here in Texas. A lot of people watching across the country. We believe that what ends up the fight that we see happening with immigrants and people of color across the country is really going to be fought and won here in Texas. And so you saw part of that fight, part of that story about who we become as a state and country take place yesterday.
Yes, and for those that weren't following yesterday, the statewide races for U.S. Senate and governor have gotten the most attention nationally. There's some other races we wanted to note. But for those that didn't see the results yesterday, the Democrats have officially elected or nominated Congressman Beto O'Rourke to run against Senator Ted Cruz, while a runoff will now take place between Dallas County Sheriff Lupe Valdez and Andrew White for the Democratic nomination to run against Governor Greg Abbott in November. In terms of these races, Cristina, what do we learn from the results yesterday about the November elections, the Democrats' prospects? So
I think there's several important things. One, in 2016, Latino voter turnout went up by 27% in the state. That was without much investment at all from the Democratic Party. We, previous to 2016, had a progressive vote deficit to change Texas of 1 million voters. That shrunk in half in 2016. So the field is changing very rapidly in Texas, but there were some nuances from yesterday's races. So one, you saw 2 Latinas in democratically controlled districts right now become the nominee for the Democratic Party, potentially the first time that Texas will send Latinas to Congress, which is crazy because it's 2018. There are 2 Latinas.
I'm sure that people listening to this are probably shocked by that statement, but unfortunately, it's even in the Latino political space in Texas, it's been a good old boys network. So I'm sure Latinas on top of it in these positions. How did Latina candidates mobilize turnout, do you think, yesterday or this last few weeks with early voting?
Well, I think that there were some particularly interesting things, especially in the Senate race that you see. One, I think Latinos in Texas are complex. They want real change on the issues that matter to their community. So for Beto O'Rourke did become the front runner and is now the candidate for the U.S. Senate seat, but he was only seeking that position against two other Democratic candidates, one who was a Latina. She took 24% of the vote. She only raised $8,000. She didn't have staff or, what we think about as a real functioning campaign, but she took 24% of the vote, especially in the Valley, which is our border area, took nearly every single county, and in other heavily Latino districts. So I think that's an important message for people like Beto O'Rourke, who's running a good progressive campaign, but is not from the Latino community. Beto is his nickname. He's Robert O'Rourke. That there is a lot of work that needs to be done in the Latino community, and that candidates need to not take for granted the Latino vote. That has happened many times here in Texas, from progressive candidates and Democratic candidates not doing the work to invest in Latinos and understand the complexity in our communities, thinking that they can just do one ad on Univision, on Univision, and that they're going to reach the entire Latino market, when the reality is that many Latinos are monolingual Spanish speakers. Young people, even if they speak Spanish, aren't watching television anymore, and so that they need to do a lot more to invest and reach our community. So I think that this is a challenge to the people that won, and Lupe Valdez and Andrew White, whoever becomes the Democratic candidate for the gubernatorial race. They cannot take Latinos for granted. They must do the work of reaching out to our community and actually addressing the issues that our community faces.
Shout out to Judge Veronica Escobar and State Senator Sylvia Garcia, who won nominations and are, very comfortably favorites for their respective November elections. Democratic candidate-elect Escobar represents the congressional district in El Paso, and State Senator Garcia in Houston. State Senator Garcia is one of the pioneers of Latina political figures in Texas. She's been very well known in Houston for a long time, so it's good to see her get this opportunity. I often tell people, Cristina, we're talking to Cristina TzinTzun from Jolt, Texas, author, activist, and someone that is on the ground doing some very important work. I often tell people, Cristina, that we almost have an apartheid-type political environment in Texas because we have a majority-minority state with very relative little political power in our community, on a state level for sure. Can you share a few of the factors that have historically prevented Latinos from fully getting engaged in voting, and what Jolt, Texas and others are doing to change that?
Well, the Latino population in our state leans extremely young. Not all Latinos come from immigrant families, but for young people, 53% of Latinos in our state young Latinos have at least one parent that's an immigrant. And so there are multiple issues. One, the Democratic Party, even though most Latinos vote for Democratic candidates, about 75% in the state, the party has failed to invest in our communities to address the real issues and concerns of our community. You've seen a push-pull in the Democratic Party on where it stands on immigration. I think that we've moved the party greatly in the right direction. And then you also have Texas has really led on voter suppression rules, like voter ID rules, prosecuting people for registering to vote if they didn't understand that they couldn't register, even putting one Latina woman in prison who thought she was a citizen but was a legal permanent resident, didn't understand the difference, put her in prison for registering to vote. So the state of Texas knows that if Latinos come out and vote, that will be a shock to the political system, not just of this state, but the entire country. And so they are working hard to suppress the power of our vote and our community. To change Texas is going to require organizing, investing, especially in young people. That is where the majority of the population growth is, especially in the Latino community. So half of all those under the age of 19 right now are Latino. I repeat that. Half of all those in the state right now that are under the age of 19 are Latino. Amen. That is a future wave of change. And then the next fact I'll say is Jolt is the only organization that's a Texas-based organization that's statewide organizing young Latinos to come out and vote. So we need real investment that's going to lift up the power of our community to vote, but also lead change on the issues that matter to our community. At Jolt, we say we don't just get good people elected, we elect good people and then we push them to do the right thing and do right by our community. And that's what we need to make sure happens in Texas.
The work that Cristina is on the front lines of, I would argue, is the most important work that can take place for the direction of this country politically, because if just from a partisan perspective and a ideological perspective, if Texas becomes a blue state, the Republican Party is basically muted in national politics.
That's right.
With their current ideology. If you look at the numbers, the electoral swings. The other part of this equation is that, and Cristina's being polite about it, but progressives, Democrats, and look, the Latino community from a funding perspective takes some responsibility for this as well.
That's
but
right.
The Democratic and progressive spaces, mostly white, we talk about the donors and the investors and the philanthropists, would throw up their hands and say, well, basically it's too big a job. We can't afford the amount of money it would take to register all these Latinos and mobilize them and overcome the voter suppression laws and overcome all these other factors. And while it would be an expensive gig, and I'm sure Jolt, Texas isn't nearly funded with the amount of resources that you could use for the work that you're doing, but the reality is, they spend all kind of money on all kind of things when they want to in politics. And the bottom line is that for that investment, it would not only be empowering Democrats, but it would be empowering Latinos. So we should have had by now Latino Democrats on the progressive side to represent the values of the totality of Texans, not just the ones that Ted Cruz claims to represent, in power, in Senate seats and in governor's seats and in more congressionals by now and in the legislature, which is very important in Texas. But that investment has not been made, and you could certainly argue that it hasn't been made because it wouldn't be empowering your typical white progressives that live in Austin or in other urban pockets necessarily. So those are some of the dynamics that Cristina's dealing with on the ground. Cristina, give us an example of what the resources that you do have, and I know you don't have the kind of resources that we need to do the work fully there, but give us an example of the kind of work that's happening on the ground with Jolt, Texas, that's empowering, getting our young Latinx population in Texas engaged in the political process.
Yeah, so for us, we really do believe that young people of color are the future of this state and country, and that is why people in power, like our governor, refuse to recognize our power because they're afraid of us. They're afraid of what we represent, and that when we will come out and vote, we won't just come out and vote on issues like immigration, but we're going to change the entire political spectrum through the power of our vote. So to get to scale and change in Texas, we're organizing young people across the state through student chapters. We're organizing people from ages 16 as early as we can to mid-30s. And our chapters, we have chapters in Fort Worth and Dallas, El Paso, Austin, places like Tyler, Texas, and we're trying to expand to the major counties where Latinos are. So all of our chapters are registering and mobilizing people to vote. They're organizing around issues that impact them, like student debt and immigrant and racial justice. And then we are celebrating our culture. So one of the things that we really do at Jolt, people know us best for the quinceañera protest that happened at the Capitol last year, where 15 of our young teen members dressed in quinceañera dresses and protested anti-immigrant legislation through the power of our culture. We don't believe that to become American, we have to erase who we are. We believe the exact opposite, that our Latino culture is what makes us strong and what we use as a weapon to fight back. So in 2018, our goal is to mobilize 100,000 Latino voters in 2018. To get to scale in Texas, to really change the state, we need to get up to 250,000, which is a really expensive and hard proposition. But people are interested in Texas. Jolt, we have no interest of being anywhere else but Texas, because we believe that Texas is the game changer for the entire country, that the issues that are impacting the Latino community, that are impacting immigrants, will be fought and won here in this state.
No, and Cristina, you've hit on so many important points, because first of all, if you have plenty of work to do in Texas. You don't need to expand that organization, because as many of my Texas friends say, the Republic of Texas, there's plenty of work to do. And if we do Texas right, if we authentically empower our community in the right way for the benefit of everyone. Notice we don't promote policies. Jolt, my personal stances here on Ray's Talk Show, we promote policies that support working people across the board. We just want fairness. We just want what's right for the future of this country. If we address this student loan issue, that benefits everyone. If we address these education issues, that benefits everyone. If we fix our broken immigration system, that benefits everybody. That benefits our economy. That benefits our culture. And there's nothing more quintessential American than Texas, Hispanic, Latino culture. I mean, you know, from Quince's culture, the food, the culture, it's Tejas, for Christ's sake.
Yeah, so, and I think that's the other thing is that, you know, we see that Latino culture is consumed in Texas. It's celebrated from our food, our dance, our music. Yet the people that produce that culture, that food, that music, the rights of our community are not being celebrated. And so we're demanding our rightful place, the rightful place of our culture to be recognized as equal to what is considered American or white culture. And we're demanding our equal rights along the way. And I think that that's what's going to empower a generation of young Latinos is this is our home, this is our state, we're fighting for our future. And when as we're coming together and starting to realize our power, that we will change not just Texas, but the entire political system of this country. And for us, it's not just through our vote, it's also through our leadership. We're building a whole generation of young Latinos. So if Texas politics do change one day, they'll be able to be at the forefront of that change and decide what happens when we hold power.
That's right. And that's the most beautiful part about the work you're doing and others is that there's so much talent in that state, in the Latino community. My goodness, there's so many people. They just need a platform to show that leadership, to service others and service the whole country. Cristina TzinTzun from Jolt, Texas. Let people know they can follow you on social media. I know you're quite a Twitter follower, and I know I enjoy following you all on the work you're doing in social media. So let people know where they can see this conversation with you.
Yeah, feel free to follow us at Jolt Texas on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And you can follow me at TzinTzun Chris, TzinTzun Chris, CRIS, at Twitter.
Earlier this week, Attorney General Jeff Sessions went to Sacramento, California to announce the Department of Justice is suing California for the recently passed state laws that restrict California law enforcement officials from cooperating on federal immigration actions. Attorney General Sessions belittled California leadership by emphasizing, quote, the federal law is supreme. He loves that word supreme, supremacy. I wonder where he gets it from. Maybe from that Anglo-American tradition of law enforcement, as he stated a few weeks ago. Governor Jerry Brown and California Attorney General Javier Becerra defended the new state laws. Quote from Attorney General Becerra, here in California, we respect the law and the Constitution. We expect the federal government to do the same. California is in the business of public safety. We're not in the business of deportations, particularly those of the innocent. What's amazing about this whole situation is that Attorney General Sessions has the time and feels it's a priority to fly clear across the country to address this issue of the federal government wanting state and local officials to hold people without warrant or just cause. Has Attorney General Sessions been to Parkland? Has he addressed the terrorism, the domestic terrorism that's running rampant in our schools and in our communities? Has he participated in the serious school safety discussion taking place in this country? Why doesn't if Jeff Sessions, if Senator Sessions is looking to target immigrants that are doing great harm to this country, why doesn't he deal with all those Russian nationals crawling all over Washington, D.C., infiltrating our country every day? No one disagrees criminals need to be taken off the streets. SB 54, one of the California state laws, even addresses that issue. The issue is criminality has too often been used as a subjective tool to distract, demonize, and discriminate. There's a great meme on the internet that says, it's a great meme only because it's so true. Slavery was once legal. Segregation was once legal. Some people get thrown in jail for pot. Others are making legal fortunes. Stop terrorizing working people and making us feel like prisoners in our own communities. And even now, they want to make us feel like prisoners in our own schools. And do your job, Sessions, like keeping the children of Parkland and anywhere else, regardless of zip code, safe. Let's hear now from Yvonne Gutierrez, and I'll be back to discuss a great announcement that took place.
I'm proud to introduce a true
this week.
champion for women's rights and progressive values,
to discuss Texas politics. One of our favorites here at Ray's Talk Show. Happy to have Yvonne Gutierrez back on the program. Yvonne, happy International Women's Day.
Yvonne, thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. Yvonne
women.
Gutierrez is the executive director of Planned Parenthood Texas Votes, the statewide electoral and legislative organization that promotes and protects the work of Planned Parenthood in Texas. Yvonne, you can imagine from hearing that introduction, you're like, wow, that's a busy woman. And there's no doubt about that. Yvonne, wanted to start with just sort of your initial thoughts. We just had, besides it being International Women's Day, of course, we just had the Texas primary elections, as you noted in our prep conversation, the first elections, federal elections and primary elections around the country. We just had those elections in Texas a few days ago. So just wanted to get your initial thoughts. If you could share with our Ray's Talk Show listeners what you think the results mean for Texas and really Latinos and all working people nationwide.
Well, I think there was a lot of excitement going into Election Day in Texas. Voter turnout in the early voting. So in Texas, we have 2 weeks of early vote prior to Election Day. And turnout was historic. We had not seen that amount of turnout since 2002 on the Democratic side. And we beat essentially turnout in the 2014, the last midterm election. So we doubled that, which is incredibly exciting. I think that because of that early energy, there was a lot of talk around the country about, there being a blue wave in Texas and what's happening. And, and then, at the end of the day, we saw that, there was a strong Republican turnout on Election Day, which we, basically knew would happen. And, that I feel like has kind of toned down the message around the blue wave possibility of Texas. But there are really important things that, to point out. And as I mentioned earlier, doubling the turnout in a primary election in a midterm year is phenomenal. So something we're really proud of. And we did also see, speaking to Latinos and to, our working families in Texas, a lot of great turnout in the major metro areas of the state. So Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and for us, and in Austin as well. And that's really important because I know that, a lot of times there's not really competitive elections in some of these urban areas. But this time, because there were congressional races on the ticket that are competitive in those areas, that we saw a lot more turnout. And we are beyond thrilled that here on International Women's Day, being able to talk about the fact that Texas is finally sending a Latina to Congress, and not
Trump
one, but two.
Is a dominant figure in this. But I would also suspect that, Senator Ted Cruz, from when I talk to my friends in Texas, it's hard for them to articulate how much they abhor that man. And I'm just wondering how much of it is sort of the compilation of both of these figures. What are the factors that are causing this wave and this surge of excitement in particular in Texas?
Well, I mean, I think, no one can deny that, the national political just rhetoric and what's happening with the current administration and just what a just horrible nightmare that is certainly having an impact. And I think that, the fact that we actually have a challenger against Ted Cruz is something that is energizing a lot of folks. As you mentioned, I don't think that there's too many words to describe the way that some folks feel about Ted Cruz in Texas. But obviously, he has presidential type money. He is tough to beat. So the turnout is really going to have to be high in order to make that a reality. But I think that the fact that it is a prospect is really exciting for folks, and just a number of organizations who have, been working in the state for a long time, some new organizations, but are really focusing on organizing and are really focusing on meeting people where they are, having conversations about what's important to Texas families, and really having candidates that folks can get behind. I think that's, you have to have the secret sauce really to win the elections. And part of it is having those candidates, having infrastructure on the ground for voters to be talked to, really. And the political
it does
environment
take that
is
kind of
always
leadership,
a factor.
because one of the things that's held us back for years and really kind of moving the progressive agenda in this country and thinking about Texas is this idea that Democrats and progressives have sort of thrown up their hands, right? Like, oh, it's too expensive. It's too hard. The numbers aren't there. It's, you've always heard these go, it's 5 media markets. We can't afford to do all this. And unfortunately, that investment wasn't just not being made in Texas, but specifically in the Latino community and in these urban pockets that you're doing so much work in. What is given people that animo? It just can't be Trump, right? I mean, because on some level, for people to run in some of these districts that have been more reliably Republican over the years, and for someone even like Beto O'Rourke, who I can verify, by the way, has been called Beto a long time. I went to college with Beto, and we used to call him Beto. So we knew he was a white guy from El Paso, and he was down, in that sense. So it's not a new phenomenon, but for him to sort of give up his relatively safe congressional seat to sort of to stretch himself and take on this challenge. So what has given Texans in your network this hope and this energy to take on these challenges?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors. I think one in that in 2016, when a lot of other states saw their Democratic voter turnout decrease, in Texas, it increased by 600,000 votes. So we were able to cut the margin of victory from Romney to Trump by almost half, which is really significant. So it was a less than 10-point win margin for Trump in Texas. So that really got a lot of people to pay attention. In the number of both state legislative districts and some of these House districts, these congressional districts, we saw Hillary Clinton win those districts. And, the margins were not, off the charts, but the fact that in these reliably Republican congressional districts that the Democrat at the top of the ticket was really able to take that. So, for us in Texas, it is continuing that momentum, continuing the engagement. We can't go backward. And, the fact that we've got these competitive congressionals, we've got somebody at the top of the ticket in Beto, who is, going across the state and really running a grassroots campaign. Now, that's not going to touch all the people that we need to touch in Texas, but that's why we need to have so many more folks engaged, volunteering, working, putting their own sweat equity into changing the state. But even the idea that it's not as far, just as you mentioned. I mean, it's incredibly expensive. We have 11 media markets in Texas. Dallas and Houston alone make it.
The Republic of Texas.
Just right. I mean, the points to get on the air, like just the cost is outrageous, right? So it's like you really have to have so much money. And also in our state elections, there's no cap on the amount of money that they can raise. So, we have a gubernatorial, like our, sitting governor has, $40 million in the bank, right? So it's tough it's a huge mountain to climb, but just the glimmer of hope that exists for Texans and the idea that we can move the needle and move the ball down the field.
And I want people listening to this, you're listening to Yvonne Gutierrez on Ray's talk show, the executive director of the Planned Parenthood Texas Votes statewide legislative advocacy organization that protects the work of Planned Parenthood in Texas, doing great work down there as always. Yvonne, and I want people to, I was watching the Texas Tribune sort of morning video event yesterday online, and they were saying basically how the Democratic statewide field is weak, and that's hurting Beto. And I'm sitting here like thinking about someone with the background like Dallas sheriff and now Democratic gubernatorial candidate Lupe Valdez, a former migrant farm worker, U.S. Army captain, federal agent, 3-term county sheriff in a major city, with a strong track record. And, it's how regardless of who you may be supporting in the runoff, how would someone not say that's not a strong candidate? So I think the fact that we have leadership in the state that's been cultivated over the years, that's finally starting to get a little platform, a bigger platform, I think speaks to the potential of not only sort of the politics of the state, but the kind of leadership that Latinos and others in Texas can take locally, statewide, and nationally. I wanted to ask you, Yvonne, so what needs to be done on the ground for people that are not aware? You have this sort of interesting and great potential in the state because there's a large chunk of Latinos and people of color that have not particularly, and there's lots of reasons for it, have not particularly engaged in voting the way our potential could be. But and some of the returns showed some hope. Those congressionals you were talking about, Democratic turnout was very comparable to Republican. Then those results didn't look very good for Congressman Hurd the other day, as an example. But right. What needs to be done over the next 6 months, and what will your organization be doing?
Sure. So, I mean, it is definitely the next 6 months, but I mean, it's also the next month and a half almost until the runoff for some of these races. And the reason that that's important as well is that, and I kind of feel like just part of what you asked also is really like, what do we need people to know? And, I think that traditionally Latinos have just not been talked to because our state is so gerrymandered. You have Latino districts that are, so really reliably Democrat Latino that you have candidates there who are reelected, and you don't have high voter turnout because people feel like, well, this is the same person over and over again. Like, I don't see how my vote is important. I don't know that it makes a difference. No one's really talking to them about voting. As we mentioned, the airwaves are expensive. How do you reach Latinos? And I think that it really truly has to be a grassroots effort and campaign within the Latino community as well. And I think that that's something that, our candidates are really going to have to focus on. Our incumbent elected officials at the state legislative level, at all levels of government, to do that work to get there, because we're never, ever going to see a statewide victory unless we have Latinos turning out and having a say. And the work that we're doing right now, so we're focused on this runoff election, the gubernatorial runoff election between Lupe Valdez and Andrew White. Andrew White is not the most progressive candidate, to say the least. I think there have been a lot of questions about where he stands on LGBT issues, obviously where he stands on choice. We do not believe that he is pro-choice, regardless of some comments that he has made. So that is a factor for us. So making sure that that the sheriff, that Lupe Valdez makes it out of this runoff is crucial, and that we see good turnout in that runoff. And so May 22nd is the date of our runoff, and so turnout there's got to be strong, and then we've got to continue the momentum over these hot summers in Texas. We still got to knock on those doors, and so we'll be doing phone, doors, digital, mail, and volunteer recruitment and engagement, and getting them on the doors and talking and working directly with the candidates in the capacity that we can. We're a state PAC, so we can work with the state candidates, but our Planned Parenthood Action Fund PAC, will be getting involved in at the federal level as well. So, Texas it's a tough job. It's a big state, but we've got a lot of good people here who have not been engaged in the process, and we need to get
the
them
attacks on Planned Parenthood in Texas have really been, unfortunately, the model for the national attacks, and we're still dealing with that on the federal budget. I know you're engaged in that as well. What else should, Yvonne, people know about the work of Planned Parenthood in Texas, and anything else you'd like to share with our Race Talk Show listeners?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think you brought up an excellent point about, kind of so goes Texas, so goes the nation, unfortunately, in the attacks on women's health. And we're seeing that, a lot of the policies that the state government has passed, excluding Planned Parenthood from participating in programs, and also, blocking access to safe legal abortion, are exactly the same policies that are happening at the federal level. So we need to pay attention as things are moving at the federal level. And I promise you that's, where they've come from. It has been since 2011, just a relentless attack on access to health care for women. As you know, Texas has the highest maternal mortality rate in the developed world. That's certainly something to note and to mention on International Women's Day. We have to do better, and we can't do better when we have elected officials who are putting politics above the health of Texas women.
Besides the electoral work that you're doing, there's just people need to, and we've talked about it on the show in previous conversations, but we have to remind people the kind of really oppressive legal attacks and policy attacks that have taken place against women, young women, women of color, immigrant women, by trying to mute the outreach that you do to help people, young people, simply with their health needs, as women and people that have limited means to get this kind of health access. So whether it's the ongoing attacks on the ACA, I know you're going to be involved, and Planned Parenthood's engaged in these, not only attacks on the organization directly, but in your funding, but these attacks on Medicaid and Medicare and the CHIP program, which it took months to get reauthorized, which is so ridiculous. And so there, all of it is connected. Yvonne Gutierrez from Parenthood, Texas Votes. Let people know where they can follow you on social media and how they can be supportive of the work that you're doing.
So definitely follow us. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter. We are on Instagram. We are on Snapchat. PP Texas Votes is where you can find us. And definitely also, if you are interested, if you are in Texas, if you know people in Texas, ask them to go to our website, www.pptexasvotes.org, and sign up to be a volunteer. I don't know, Ray, if you are familiar with a new tool called Hustle, but you can actually text voters and encourage them to vote. So really anywhere you are in the country, you can be helpful in pushing voter turnout in Texas, and we encourage folks to be helpful. And if you contact us, we will help get you set up to volunteer in that way with us as well.
The main man, Pope Francis, has announced this week that the former Archbishop of El Salvador, Oscar Romero, has been cleared to be approved in the coming months for sainthood. Romero was the Archbishop of El Salvador and spoke out against the oppression and violent government regime of the time, and eventually was assassinated. Romero has been a symbol of liberation for the voiceless of Latin America for decades, and was the subject of the movie Romero that starred Puerto Rican actor Raul Julia. Romero was what leadership is supposed to be, what we were taught in our community, and what we shot and what we continue to display day after day after day, especially our women, thinking about International Women's Day. Courageousness, righteousness, a commitment to defending the voiceless in our society, and most importantly, servant leadership. Mil gracias, Papa Francis, and thank you, Archbishop Romero, soon to be Saint Romero, for the example you still set for all of us. Thanks again to Yvonne Gutierrez and Cristina TzinTzun for joining us on Ray's Talk Show this week, and keep the conversation going about Texas, la política, and all the other issues impacting our society and our community on social media, on Twitter at Ray's Podcast, Twitter or Facebook, Ray's Podcast, and at Ray's Latino Talk, RAYS Latino Talk on Instagram. Have a great weekend and continue to resist.